we are going to move into our next session on the power of knowledge co-creation. There's been two critical pillars for the entire of the work, and this and equitable partnerships has been very fundamental to that. So I'm going to invite Leon to introduce the session and to introduce our speakers on the next one. Thank you, Leon.
Okay, thanks very much, Rosie, and it's an enormous privilege to introduce the speakers for the next session. My wonderful colleagues at Bristol and at the London Interdisciplinary School. So we've got Rhona Brown, who's a senior research associate on TESF and has been doing marvelous work in helping us synthesize and curate our work. And an interesting fact about Rhona is that she does her best thinking while riding her bike. So I'm not sure we'll hear much about that today, but it might be something you want to take up with Rhona afterwards. Rafael has been playing a leading role in our capacity mobilization work across the network. And he's going to be talking to us today about some of that. And an interesting fact about Rafael is that he grows 7 different types of berries in his garden. So there you go, things that we never knew about each other before. And the last person I'd like to introduce is Ash Brockwell, who has been a companion, a consistent companion as our external evaluator on our journey. And he's helped us learn from what we've been doing as we've been going through the monitoring, evaluation and learning process that he's going to talk to us a little bit about today. And an interesting fact about Ash is that he enjoys making art with unusual media, like natural ochre pigments, chalk and clay, or incorporating random objects into his paintings. So how could I make a better introduction to these wonderful people? Over to you, Rhona, to get the ball rolling.
Thank you very much, Leon. And I hope for everyone today, you'll see lots of the strands that are already being woven across the other parts of the presentation today will be coming alive in this one as well. And the 2 documents, the call to action around knowledge co-creation, around ethical partnerships, we'll be speaking to those today. But please do also keep an eye out for forthcoming reports and papers. There's a lot more to say. And although this is a kind of a closing today, it really feels like an opening in many ways as well. So I'd like to start a bit by setting the scene for this presentation by showing 2 clips from project films. The first one is from Healing is in the Pot, who used an active learning framework to inform their work about sustainable and nutritious food choices. And the second is from Universities as Sustainable Communities, who co-developed, sorry, I'm just trying to get my slide to move, it seems pretty stubborn, there we go, who co-developed their own participatory practices with student activists in ways that they described as organic and intuitive. And I hope that through these, it will just introduce some of the strands which are going to be interwoven into the rest of this presentation about the power of knowledge co-creation. I hope you enjoy them.
I thought there would be tutors teaching us in classrooms and maybe exams or tests to write about what we have learned. It was not like that. It was like a family meeting, talking about things you want to understand. There was no pressure. It was a relief. It was giving and getting.
Because the name says it's participatory, that means you're doing something. So I'm already thinking about something fun, something creative, and something engaging, because if it's participatory, then it means you're going to be talking with people, doing stuff with people. So that's the first thing that comes to mind.
And is it always fun?
It's not always fun, that's for sure. I mean, it takes a lot of time in terms of planning, money, and it's emotionally draining.
So many thanks to the filmmakers of those two films, and I'll put the links in the chat later that you can watch those whole films. But there are many strands which we'll come back to in those, but three of the main ones I'll start with here. And first is that the knowledge and learning that we've gained from looking across these 67 projects, across these 4 hubs, means that we're really quite confident in strongly advocating for more space for co-engaged, co-creative approaches to research and knowledge production in order to tackle lots of the complex and wicked problems of unequal and unsustainable development, which you've heard a lot about this morning. And we believe that knowledge co-creation has the potential to do this, both to get a deeper understanding of the problems themselves and the issues being faced, but also to generate possible, more relevant, context-specific solutions or pathways forward. And across our projects, different projects drew on different aspects of co-creation in their work. Some teams were already very experienced in these approaches. Others were adopting them for the first time, or maybe applying them to research context for the first time. And for others, they were maybe drawing on aspects of co-engaged research to integrate into more traditional research designs, which were familiar to them. So as ever, there was no one way to do this kind of work. There was no one size fits all. But we hope that we can amplify some of the areas of convergence and some of the key messages which were gleaned from looking across all these very diverse projects. But as we saw in that clip as well, we're not romanticizing these approaches. A knowledge co-creative approach is new in many contexts, and even where it is familiar, it's not to be undertaken lightly. Movement towards knowledge co-creation and democratization of knowledge production requires both really practical support and resources, as well as less tangible and difficult breaking down of traditional barriers, boundaries, and hierarchies. And just before I go into our evidence-based kind of recommendations, I think there's a quote from my Somali colleague, Jama Adam, which I think brings some of these points together really nicely. Here in this quote, he's speaking as someone with lived experience, in this case as a nomadic pastoralist, of the challenges being faced by the communities that he cares about and the will to take action. And he described here his decision to submit his TESF proposal 3 years ago. He says, "I feel agony and upset how our land is dramatically changing and seems an uninhabitable place. I asked myself what I can do. Then I switched angles through my heart and brain to write a proposal." So thank you, Jama, for letting me share that. And I think it shows this drive, this engagement with lived experience and to take action in ways which are meaningful and relevant, and which we can all learn a lot from. So I'd like to kind of focus on kind of 7, as ever, interconnected recommendations based on the knowledge, learning and experience that have come across these projects. And the first one here is we're looking for research which actively seeks diversity and makes intentional efforts to redress historical inequities. And an underpinning principle of TESF from the beginning has been around transdisciplinarity in the broadest sense. So we've seen the value of research that's able to draw on perspectives from different disciplines and interests, and that includes researchers from across the academic disciplines, but also professional knowledge and practical know-how held by practitioners, policymakers, leaders, activists, especially also including children and young people, and Indigenous and local knowledge, which is held in communities. And we've seen in many, many examples of how this diversity helps broaden the perspectives and strengthen the relevance and the sustainability of projects. I'm just going to draw on one, but there were so many. Water Classrooms project in India, where their team involved water researchers, educators, data scientists, disaster management experts, gender experts, artists, musicians, filmmakers. And when the team were reflecting on what this diversity brought them, they highlighted that they were able to look with students at not just the physical and biological aspects of water, but to bring in the social, the cultural, and the ethical aspects as well. And one of their students had noted, for example, "I never thought water and gender could be related topics." And I think that just kind of highlights the wickedness of these wicked challenges and the kind of approaches which are needed to tackle them. But education and research about education can exclude and it can reinforce inequalities. So of course it's necessary to include and foreground forgotten and neglected perspectives, including those of children and young people, and to really value those non-traditional partners and building those partnerships. And again, different projects have done this in different ways. For some, this meant working closely with the most marginalised. For others, it meant questioning the very idea of marginalisation. And in others, it meant working with the privileged to examine, excuse me, and understand their privilege. The second recommendation here is about further work needed to decolonise research. And this cuts across many of the other points, but briefly here, this is around challenging the dominant framings of research and reconceptualising the problems which are being addressed. For example, some projects looked at different perspectives on what well-being is, what citizenship is, or what sustainability is. And across the India projects and hub team, they asked important questions around what is to be sustained when we talk about sustainability. Projects worked in areas where there were real disconnects and areas of dissonance, for example, between national formal school curricula and the knowledge and experience of children. And in one example, children from tribal communities in India. And that approach allowed them to reveal what they called a refreshing perspective on what education can aim to do towards sustainable ways of living, learning, and earning, really highlighting the value of opening up to other knowledges beyond what is included in the formal curriculum. Another area we saw really clearly was the importance of critical, participatory, and action-oriented research designs. And this is research which aims both to understand the issues from new perspectives, as I've just talked about, but also for action-oriented research. And as the South Africa Hub also identified, activism-oriented research, which directly benefits participants. And some really concrete examples have been seen through eco-schools in India and Somaliland and Rwanda, in school food gardens. And I like that bit in the clip in the break about, we can't do anything when our stomach is empty. So really, tangible benefits for the participants who are involved in these projects. And there's one quote from a South African water mapping project which highlighted this for me, where they said, "We are not mapping the water for Bristol, but for the poor and the elderly people of Cape Town." Another key area which has come up again and again this morning is around research grounded in lived experience. And this links very closely to the need for methods to elevate and bring this experience to life. And in the top right corner there, you'll just see a word cloud representing some of the methods which project teams used to try and access and understand these experiences and learn from them. And not only is this part of methodological approach, it's really core to our claims of credibility and quality research, that the research is based on these voices, on these experiences of people who have the lived experience of these very, very complex realities. And it's also key to our claims to ethical research, linked not to diversity and inclusion in any tick box tokenistic way, but to do with supporting efforts for epistemic and social justice. So the methods which let you do this, we've seen how varied they are, but overall these were selected because they gave participants a range of ways and tools to express themselves and the complexities in their lives. They can generate intense detail, but also nuance. They offer ways to ease, in some regard, the power disparities, which are often there between researchers and participants. And also they offer diverse alternatives to academic text when it comes to sharing and to sharing that knowledge and that learning. And very closely linked with these ideas around methods was the idea of adaptation and fluidity and the idea of responsibility. And in so many research projects, we see that built in from the start are these predetermined methods and approaches but our projects have shown the real importance, but also the time and resource it takes to do this, to be emergent, to be flexible. For example, in one Somali project, they started off with individual interviews, but it made people feel boxed in and unable to express themselves fully. So then they moved to more collective creative methods, including poetry and dancing and drama, which they said, quote, nurtured creativity, belonging, unity, and understanding. And the final two areas are of particular importance. One is around ethics. And the main thing to highlight here is how far beyond procedural ethics or institutional protocols we've seen that you need to go to really look at ideas of local ethos, of everyday, contextually meaningful relational ethics in practice, which goes beyond a signed informed consent form, which is then harming the very trust and relationship that you're trying to build up. One of the key ideas that emerged in this area was the idea of creating safe spaces and ensuring safe language. And we saw in the film clip as well about how intense and emotionally draining co-creative research can be. And this is one area where this idea of the safe space came up. It can be unsettling, it can be upsetting, and it can be tense. One teenage mother in Rwanda and one of their projects reflected, they listened to my story, humiliating as it may have been. At some point, I felt I was telling it to people I already knew. I felt they judged me less, but listened more. And particularly across the India projects, the idea of critical empathy came out. This has emerged as a way of confronting some of these very difficult issues and emotions, but being able to shift into a place where more transformative practice can take place. And this requires these safe spaces. And finally, but very heavily weighted, is the need to build in scaffolding and support and capacity mobilization around knowledge co-creative approaches. This is a demanding approach in terms of time, resource, energy, and emotions. For teams who are working across boundaries in a responsive way, that's boundaries of disciplines, communities, partners, cultures, languages, this requires a really distinct skill set, the knowledge, the attitudes, the capacities to do this. And it's not normally part of formal training. There's so many great examples of how projects have built in this support through peer support groups, through skills and training sessions, through reflective practice and on-the-job learning, through recognizing that challenges are often wrapped up with opportunities for learning. But really the idea around the capacities to undertake this kind of work should not be underestimated. And I'll pass over to Rafael now that can talk a little bit more about that wider framing of support, which is there to support this kind of work.
Thanks, Rhona. Yes, okay, so what we've seen today are, the fruits from 67 projects which took place during a pandemic and also through the budgetary cuts in the UK context to the ODA. I'm just going to give you share a link to a paper about this here. But if we're talking about the ethics of partnerships in the context of this kind of work, we've got to acknowledge the challenges that these projects have faced. So, historically, I'm sure we're all aware about the kind of inequities we often see in international research partnerships where funded by Northern agencies, where very often research can be dominated by Northern partners, dominating the budget, but also taking intellectual leadership over this work and the research process itself. So what we've seen in TESF is an intentional process to try and counter these historic inequities. And as such, we've really got an opportunity to understand some of the conditions and the processes and structures for ethical research partnerships in the context of this kind of work. So on the left side of the screen here, you can see some of the principles which we kind of took with us from the outset in this network. Just the aspiration of foregrounding local agendas and agency across all of this work at the network level, taking a distributed and relational view of capacities and a positive one as well, an asset-based view of capacities, as well as opening spaces for collaboration such as this today, which are minimally distorted by power relations. And so you can see on the right-hand side of the screen here, just a model of the network itself. Rhona, can you just click on this screen? So what we've got here is flat rather than a hierarchical network structure in TSF. So we've referred to this sometimes as the hub and spokes model. That's how we've referred to the network. It's flat rather than hierarchical in nature. And so this means that we have distributed and democratic leadership within the network, in contrast to top-down hierarchical models. So this means that country teams have been involved in every step of decision-making within the network. And I kind of want to say, actually, it wouldn't be possible to do this any other way. The 67 projects you've seen today couldn't have taken place mandated from Bristol, which as the recipient of the funding, couldn't have mandated these projects. They reflect local priorities in each of these contexts. So that's an important point to make, I think. That democratization of leadership in the context of this kind of work isn't just desirable, but it's necessary to do this. I can give some examples of this as well. That's enabled flexible, contextual decision making. So, for example, in 3 of the 4 hubs, we had an open call for proposals. In one of the hubs, due to kind of political sensitivities, it wasn't desirable to do that. It would have endangered the efforts of people on the ground. And so an invitational approach was taken. So this kind of democratic space has allowed that flexibility. Just another example of that, of these 67 projects, these were all evaluated by an international team. Their proposals were initially evaluated by an international team. But every decision in every case was made at the national level by these hubs. So that's just an example of the kind of structures that need to be in place to produce this amazing work that we've been seeing from TESF. I just want to give one more example. So Rhona, if you can just click again. We talk about capacity mobilization and strengthening. That's a kind of phrase that you will have heard again and again through today. We started out with using the term capacity development, which didn't gain much traction, in fact, in some contexts. And so we've, as I say, we're taking an asset-based view of capacity, something that people already have. And really, we see the work within the network as about mobilizing that capacity and sharing knowledge and skills within the network, which is already there. So that's the approach, really, at a principles level, rather than the kind of deficit-based approach, which is kind of implicit in a lot of training work. So, taking a capacity mobilization perspective on this has involved also one example of that will be the kind of communities of practice model, which we've used, as opposed to a training-based one, which is about really creating spaces for people to share their knowledge, their perspectives and skills, and provide intellectual as well as emotional and practical support to peers within national context, but internationally as well. So, those are some of the, I could really talk about this for a lot longer. I have 2 minutes, but I also want to just acknowledge that power asymmetries endure as well, despite these best efforts, despite these principles. Just an example of that, something which is purely optional and invitational, like an invitation to join a session, a capacity mobilization session, can in some contexts unintentionally be considered as an obligation. Depending on who's inviting, it can be seen as an obligation. So we've been learning a lot about how to implement these kind of principles, but also some of the challenges we've faced as well. And part of this really has been the approach we've taken to MELD and monitoring, evaluation and learning through this work, which has really opened up so much learning for us. And to introduce that, I'm just going to hand over to my colleague, Ash Brockwell.
Thanks, Rafael. Can I have the next slide, Rosie? Thank you. So the monitoring, evaluation and learning approach that we took during this project was informed by a values-centered approach. It's an approach that was developed initially at the University of Brighton in collaboration with a lot of partners from different civil society organizations. And it's an approach that really puts the project participants at the center in terms of talking about what they find most valuable, meaningful and worthwhile. And so instead of starting with a framework of indicators that was created in Bristol from the top down or imposed by the funders, what we started with was a co-created indicator framework, which was developed through the initial project launch workshop, refined further through some development workshops in South Africa and Rwanda. We would have also conducted workshops in India and Somaliland if it hadn't been for the pandemic. But we created this framework which had these 5 dimensions or 5 areas. People and relationships, which really spoke to the network aspect of the project. Capacities, which Rafael has also focused on, thinking about capacity mobilization. The knowledge that was created during the projects in the sense of are they meeting their research objectives. The outputs they created and how they shared those, or the audiences to which they disseminated them. And then finally, the outcomes and legacies of the projects. And so the way that this worked across the whole project was that each of the individual funded projects created an ambition statement using only these 5 headings. So within each of these 5 headings, they had complete freedom to define what it was that they found most valuable, meaningful and worthwhile. What were they trying to achieve with their projects, rather than complying with any kind of top-down agenda. Having created these ambition statements, they then worked with the hubs to produce midterm reports and end of project reports. And those end of project reports were then synthesized by the hubs into hub level reports. And Rhona has done an amazing job in pulling together those hub level reports to create a kind of network level synthesis report. I've also been working as an external evaluator to look across these different dimensions of the framework and to see what have been the outcomes, what have been the achievements of the project in each of these categories, and the extent to which the project met its kind of decolonial ambitions or expectations as a whole as well. So there's certain things like mother tongue languages and certain aspects like overcoming historical inequalities and bringing in marginalized groups that were expectations of the project as a whole. And the final piece of evaluative work that I've been doing together with Freya Gascoigne, who's an intern here at London Interdisciplinary School, which is the artist who created this amazing baobab here on the right. And this is an image of the legacies of transforming education for sustainable futures as a network, using what we call a legacy tangibility scale. So typically in evaluation, people focus on the things that are most tangible. So you can see here the fruits of the tree are things like books, things like outputs, tangible outputs that people can pick up and hold, articles, digital outputs, things like follow-up funding. So these very kind of visible, tangible things are what traditionally gets evaluated. But what we've been able to do through taking this value-centered approach is to actually drill down and find some of these underlying legacies that underpin these. So things like frameworks, pedagogies, methods, different ways of doing research, different ways of engaging, and then things that we call semi-tangible legacies like relationships and networks and affective states, changes in the ways that people feel in relation to each other. And then at the roots of the tree, at the bottom here, you've got these intangible legacies, things like knowledge hierarchies, and things like embodied knowledges and tacit knowledges that are difficult to articulate in words. And below that, at the very bottom here, you've got latent values, so changes in the ways that people value themselves and the environment, which they might not even be able to be fully aware of. So this just summarizes how the monitoring and evaluation approach that we took, which is this, as I say, is a very value-centered, this very participatory, very inclusive, very democratic approach, helps to reveal some of these legacies that traditional methods of evaluation that come in with like a logical framework, which is imposed by a funder, perhaps wouldn't have been able to identify. So there are reports, there's a paper which was published last year in a journal called Compare, which hopefully can be shared in the chat, which explains more of the theory underpinning this value-centered evaluation approach. But I'm going to leave it there now and just hand back to Leon for some final remarks. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you so much, Ash, and thank you so much, Rafael and Rhona, for that really interesting, thought-provoking overview of the opportunities, the barriers, the affordances, the amazing potential offered by knowledge co-creation, but also the real challenges of putting this kind of work into practice. And I think it underlines, you know, the enormous efforts that our hub teams have gone to in terms of supporting our projects and providing the scaffolding that's needed